Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing some waiver wire news for the San Jose Sharks. And before anybody gets too excited, no, Barclay Goodrow was not put on waivers, neither was Nick Leddy. Instead, the Sharks actually picked up a player from the Washington Capitals, a young 22-year-old right-hand defenseman, Vincent Iorio. And I might not normally make a video about a relatively minor acquisition such as this one, but it actually has some pretty far-reaching implications for this organization and forces them to answer some pretty tough questions over the coming weeks. But before we get into those, a little bit more about Iorio. He has been in a very similar situation as to what Jack Thompson has been with in this past couple of years with San Jose. He's kind of like the 8th or 9th defenseman with the Capitals, has had some good preseasons and training camps, but hasn't quite been able to leapfrog some of their more established players, especially since Washington is actually a pretty good team, having finished first place in the regular season in the Eastern Conference this past season. As such, over the past few years, he has been easily sent down due to being waiver exempt, but this year, now having to pass through the waiver wire, the Sharks jump at the first opportunity to pick him up. Now, these past seasons, he's had a couple of games in the NHL here or there, but it has mostly been spent in the AHL. But it's very important to mention what organization he has been playing with, that being the Hershey Bears, one of the best teams in the AHL over these past few seasons. This year had a little bit of a disappointing finish early on in the playoffs, but they still had a first-place Atlantic Division finish in the regular season, and in the 2 years prior to that, 23-24 and 22-23, they won back-to-back Calder Cup championships. They're basically the Florida Panthers of the AHL, and Iorio has played a decent role with them in each of these last 3 seasons, having had over 60 regular season games in all 3 years, and even some few playoff games here or there when he hasn't been up with the main squad in Washington. As such, it was a pretty interesting move for Mike Grier to make, to pick up a young right-handed defenseman that the Sharks desperately do need. And having watched the Sharks' defense over these last couple of games against Carolina and Anaheim, literally anything would probably end up being an improvement, and so that's what the justification was. Now, as I mentioned, some tough questions are brought up with this move being made, and the first one was how it even happened in the first place. The Sharks obviously had an active roster of 23 players. Well, this move came with a corresponding roster move of putting Timothy Liljegren onto the injured reserve. This means that he's going to be out a minimum of a week, and as such will not be playing in any of the weekend games against Utah and Pittsburgh. However, the next question becomes what happens when Liljegren is healthy again, because while he's going to be missing a week, he could easily return by the game next week. As such, the Sharks will have to end up creating a roster spot for him and send somebody down. There are a few options here in that case. The first of which would be to send down a forward, go from 13 forwards to 12 and run with 9 defensemen, but this is extremely unlikely, I would imagine, for the Sharks to actually do. They don't really want to run 12 when one of those 12 is Ryan Reeves, who definitely should not be playing a full 82-game season in the NHL at this point of his career, so I imagine they will want to maintain at least 13 forwards here up with the Sharks. As such, it does pretty much have to be a defenseman. There are a few choices, the first of which would be Iorio himself. Theoretically, they could send him right back onto the waiver wire, at which point the Capitals would end up picking him back up for free, but I highly doubt that this is what Mike Grier's plan would be in the case of a Timothy Liljegren short-term injury. Feels as though they'd probably want to hang on to him. Another option would be Sam Dickinson. He is the easiest choice simply because he is the only one on this blue line who is not having to pass through waivers when being sent down, but he would be going back to the OHL and be unable to be called back up until the end of his OHL season. So that would basically do it for Sam Dickinson's NHL year this season, and I feel as though it is just way too early to make a call like that. Yes, his game against Carolina most recently was quite bad, but his first career game against Anaheim was actually pretty good, and so I would think the Sharks would want to give him more of a sample size, and if Liljegren is going to be back next week, that would not be enough time to really understand what you have here with Sam Dickinson. For all we know, he comes out on Friday against Utah and plays really well, and suddenly now he's actually one of your better defensemen. So the Sharks, I don't think that that is the correct choice. Instead, probably the best choice would be someone like Vincent Iorio, who has yet to play even a single game for the Sharks this season. He had a few preseason games, but to very mixed results, and while Iorio is not a direct replacement for him, he doesn't quite have the experience or the size of Iorio, he's still physically imposing himself at 6'3", and obviously has much more of a future on this team just due to his age, and so Iorio feels like he could end up easily being the odd man out. One other possible choice to be put onto waivers is someone like John Klingberg, it would be very much an awkward look for the team because they literally just signed him to a $4 million contract this past offseason. But the fact is that Klingberg has been a direct liability in multiple games already this season. He was awful against Carolina. He was even more awful against Anaheim. In fact, if he had just played an average game against the Ducks, the Sharks probably win that particular game. So Klingberg, he has been just costing Sharks multiple goals and multiple games already this season. You can't really justify keeping him in the lineup at that point. So the Sharks, it would be a tough call to make, but they might actually have to pull the trigger there. I know there are also some people hoping that maybe Nick Leddy could be put onto waivers, but it really seems the Sharks coaching staff likes him as a player, so I highly doubt it happens. There is one other possible move that could be made here in the short term. That is not to send a player down, but instead to trade a player away on the blue line. None of them really have much value outside of Mukhamadullin and Dickinson, who are obviously not going anywhere, except Mario Ferraro. He has been in trade rumors for a while at this point. It was thought maybe he could get moved at the beginning of the year, he could get moved before the draft, he could get moved at last year's deadline. Well, perhaps something is somewhat imminent, and maybe that's why Mike Grier made this trade in the first place. If they move Ferraro and get a draft pick back in return, that does create the space necessary. I doubt that this is what's happening, though it is technically a possibility. What is much more likely, I would say, is that Liljegren's injury is not short-term and is instead long-term, and that he's out for like a month, maybe even a couple of months, and that the Sharks will actually have the sample size necessary to be able to make an informed decision about who they end up getting rid of. It will give them up to that 9-game window for Sam Dickinson to see what he can do in the NHL. It'll give Iorio enough games to see if he truly is ready to play in these big leagues. It'll give Desharnais probably a few games to see if he can stick around, Klingberg to see if he can turn things around himself for this season, and then finally when Liljegren maybe does return in like late November, early December, that's when the Sharks can actually make their choice. I would guess that this is what actually is happening here, but who knows? Obviously, we have no information about what this injury truly is. There are a couple of other things that I do want to mention here in relation to this move. The first of which is, what does this end up meaning for Jack Thompson? Because as I mentioned earlier on, he came into this season as the 9th defenseman on the depth chart. It was not enough to maintain a spot in the NHL, but it seemed like he was going to be basically like the first call-up for the Sharks if an injury or a couple of injuries were to occur. But now, with Iorio being added into the fold, Thompson falls to 10th on the Sharks depth chart. Now his chances of actually playing in the NHL this season, or actually playing more than a small handful of games in the NHL this season, is very, very low. Perhaps post-deadline he could end up getting called back up, but there's not really much to work with there. And so he's kind of falling into more of a similar position as to what we saw from Thomas Bordeleau and Danil Gushchin this past season. As much as it would be nice to hold on to yet another young right-handed defenseman, I'm not sure if Jack Thompson will really want to end up sticking around, and so we could perhaps see him get traded sooner rather than later, or at the latest maybe this off-season, as he would be up for a new contract with the Sharks. It's very possible that this Iorio move has made Thompson a little bit more expendable. The other thing to mention here is something that I harped on quite consistently through the offseason, which is the Sharks' contract situation. They had put themselves into a spot where they needed to make a move because they had 49 out of 50 NHL contracts, and the moment that Misa and Dickinson had played more than 9 games in the NHL, it would put the Sharks at 51 out of 50. Well, right before the season began, they got rid of both Grundstrom and Guriev and got back Ryan Ellis in return, and that put the Sharks at 50 out of 50 contracts. I mentioned that that is at the very least legal. However, it is not really optimal because it lacks the flexibility, and indeed the waiver wire is one of those flexible things you like to have available to you. And as we can see with this Iorio acquisition, the Sharks are now right back where they started, 49 out of 50 contracts, and we are ever so slightly closer to that deadline of both Dickinson and Misa actually playing 10 games. Now, it is still possible that one of them, or even both of them, do get sent down and the Sharks don't actually have to make a move, but I hope that that's not really what the Sharks are planning. I hope Misa and Dickinson can stick around, which would mean that the Sharks do have to get rid of a player. There is still a few weeks to go before that decision does need to be made, but it is important to mention that just sending a guy like Vincent Desharnais onto waivers and putting putting him into the AHL, that isn't actually solving your issue unless he gets picked up by another team. So it's possible that the Sharks will be forced to make a trade. Yes, they can easily get rid of like an AHL player, but they might have to give up some value to do so. And so it again speaks to perhaps some of the contract mismanagement back in this offseason that the Sharks have now put themselves into a position where even a simple waiver wire pickup has them in a bit of an awkward spot. But that will do it for this video. It is still a move that I do kind of like. You know, the Sharks are obviously lacking in this one particular position in their prospect pool. Iorio, while maybe not the most promising of players, could perhaps provide a spark to this team that desperately needs it, having started the year with 3 straight losses. So we'll see if he gets into some action this weekend, one or perhaps even both games. Whatever will happen. Class dismissed.